All right.
So, Glenn, I'm so excited to have this conversation and welcome to our viewing audience. This is my first podcast episode. In case this is your first time just clicking on this, maybe by the time you look at this, we've done several of these. But I'm Clarissa, and this podcast series is called Auntie on the Air Mattress. It's a houseless series because there's so many people in my age range who are millennials looking to buy homes, and we're really struggling to become first-time homeowners given the current crisis that is happening. And Glennon, I know that you've been a longtime professional looking at these issues, so I'm really excited, like I said, about this conversation. I know you've heard my stories and about the struggles that I faced in becoming a homeowner. So I'm really interested to hear from you because I've heard from many friends who describe this current situation as a housing crisis or a housing shortage. But I'm wondering from your research, would you consider it a housing shortage or a housing crisis?
So, I would definitely say yes, we have a housing shortage, and it's becoming more severe, probably annually, in Central Ohio. In terms of, I don't know what the formal definition of a crisis is, and I don't know that I would say we are at the point where everyone is experiencing a crisis and like everyone is feeling the effects of a crisis, but I would say that for certain populations, yes, this is a crisis. And I'd say that's probably particularly households making, around median area income or below, or maybe, below 70 or 75,000. And that probably includes quite a few single income households, which would include single people or households with one earner. For those groups, I think that, yes, it's definitely, and people who are probably on fixed incomes. Older people tend to fall into that category more. It's at a point where, if those people do own homes, I think it's very difficult for them to imagine selling right now, because I don't think that they could get something equal or better. And better is usually what you're trying to do, right? Maybe equal for what they would get. And rates are very high right now. And we particularly have, the shortages in terms of units are more severe for certain housing price points, and any housing price point having a shortage is a problem, right? Even if it's really high, in, housing price point, because, if you think about it, if you've got houses like 500,000 to $1 million, which is an area where we have a relatively large shortage right now, that means that people looking for homes in that price range buy something less expensive. And so that home then goes off the market for households that otherwise would have been able to afford it. And they can likely outbid, right, other people on that property. So they might be driving up there. They might do massive improvements, right? They might spend that extra money they were going to spend on the bigger house on making the house they're buying as nice as that other house would have been, right? So upgrades, additions and stuff, which raises the value of the property, right? Taking it out of reach for some people and impacting the houses around it, because home valuations are determined in part by the values of the homes around your home, right? And so that becomes problematic. Like there's like a trickle down effect, right? And the only thing about trickle down economics maybe that's accurate is that like bad shit trickles down, pardon me, bad, but bad, like in terms of this, that it impacts lower income people who can't afford that 500,000 to $1 million house, but they could afford, right?
Exactly. Because I know for me, I've been trying to find something that's less than $200,000.
Oh, I
Which
know.
in the past I heard people say, that was easy. They're like, oh, 200,000 will buy you a lot of house. And now it's like that's not the case. Like trying to find something less than 200,000 is
with my income. I've got one income in my household, and that's about where I can afford. And it's really, and with rates in particular, it makes it, you have to go even lower, right? In terms of what that monthly payment is. So even shortages higher up trickle down is the point, right?
So
you want to have enough housing in every area of demand, and we have shortages in multiple areas.
Right. Definitely, because what you mentioned in terms of people who might be looking at those more expensive homes and they're looking to downsize, what I've been running into is I've read a lot of reports about how baby boomers, people my parents' age who are now downsizing So they're in the market and they're
Mhm.
looking at a lot of times smaller homes
Mhm.
because of this downside. So they're looking at the same houses that I'm looking at, which would be traditionally considered, as
Mhm.
starter homes. So I'm wondering what you're learning or even seeing what the data shows in terms of these millennials and baby boomers competing for the same homes.
So I haven't really seen that data saying that. I believe that that dynamic is likely happening though, and that's probably also because we're not building enough variety, right, in terms of housing type, right? Like Columbus isn't really an area where you could own a flat,
Mm,
right? Like I don't know anyone that owns a flat in Columbus.
right.
I'm sure there are people downtown, but those aren't the kind of flats I'm talking about that
All
are
right.
for,
Those could be expensive.
right? Which are like common all over Europe and in denser areas, right? And
Mhm.
so we are very much wedded to single family homes. And so if you want to downsize and stay in a single family home, yeah, you're going to be competing with young people for starter homes because those are, and in Central Ohio, we have so much post-war, like post-World War II housing stock, which are a lot of ranches or Cape Cods, right? Maybe one room upstairs, but you don't have to use that, right? Because they're 2 bedrooms downstairs. And if you're an older couple, you don't need more than a bedroom or two, so you don't have to use the stairs every day. And those ranches are attractive for that. A lot of 60s era housing as well, which is a lot of ranches as well, right? And so those homes are really, becoming very attractive for older people. And part of that is we're not building enough housing for older adults either. And we need to think, I would argue build age-friendly communities that are,
Mm,
accessible for people of all ages. But we also have older adults tend to be on fixed incomes,
right.
right? And so they, it might be challenging and competing with millennials for starter homes. Part of that might be that they need to move out of these suburbs, right? They need to move out of the suburbs where they were, perhaps,
Mhm.
and into neighborhoods, maybe in Columbus, right? Or like, that aren't as high, taxed as some of the suburbs are and things like that.
Which makes
So
sense,
they might be,
especially when they don't have kids in the schools, the
yeah, if you don't
urban
have kids
areas
in
and
the
all that
schools, you
anymore.
want to get out of that district or at least out of the city because, Worthington's even more expensive than the Worthington district is at least what I hear, or as an example, because those school districts are larger than the cities in Central Ohio, except for
Mm.
Columbus, which is smaller. The school district is smaller than the city. Um, but, I do think we need to build more, the solution I see is build more diverse housing. And by diverse, I mean just different types of housing and build more housing that is built with, universal design concepts so that people can age in place. People are
Right, that makes
downsizing in
sense.
part because they can't age in place, right? They've
Right, like
got
I talked to an older couple the other day. They said that they're actually looking as well, but they were
mhm,
like, "We can't have stairs though. We need to make sure this is going to be a
yep.
home that we can
Mhm.
spend the last 20 or 30 years of our lives in and don't have to worry about going up and down stairs."
Well, we need to be thinking critically about how can we make that affordable for older adults and how can we build housing for older adults that is affordable, right? Because there are a lot of great single story condos being built all over, especially the north end and all the periphery of Columbus, right? But some of these
Mm.
are outrageously expensive,
Oh my
right?
goodness. Yes,
Just
it's so wild.
like, I mean, you can spend $700,000 on a 2 or 3 bedroom ranch that's really, not gigantic in some of these neighborhoods. And so, how can we build affordably and enable our older adults to downsize and give up those, 4 bedroom, 2.5 bathroom, big yard homes that they were in that maybe have the stairs, right? Or the multi levels with all the stairs everywhere. You can't even go to the bathroom without getting on stairs in some of those, right? How can
Exactly.
we we help them downsize in a way that they can afford so they can live, right? Because that
No,
is
that makes
an
sense to me.
issue for older people.
Right. And building a diverse housing stock, I definitely agree with you because I know that there have been several studies done that have suggested that Columbus is and Central Ohio are drastically underbuilding. And with
Oh
our
yes.
population growth of about 50
Mhm.
new people moving to this area every day, if
Mhm.
we don't hurry up now, we're never going to catch up. So I'm wondering though, with looking at this type of problem, do
Mhm.
you think that this is a long-term systemic problem within the US right now, or is it more of just a short-term issue given the economy?
So I would say yes to both. essentially, like that there are both long-term systemic problems in housing in the US right now, but there are also short-term issues like this shortage that we're experiencing right now that we, I think, do have the ability to address. We just have to work together, and every municipality needs to play their part. But there are these long-term systemic issues that are going to make that difficult. Right. And so,
Like
like,
which types of things would you
so there are
consider?
three, I think, really big long-term issues, right? And
Right.
so one is segregation. And by segregation, I mean a couple of things. I mean, like, right, we have racial, socio-demographic segregation, economic segregation, and racial ethnic segregation, right, in our metro areas. But we also have a lot of jurisdictional fragmentation. Right. In areas with more jurisdictional fragmentation tend to have more segregation also. And we're in a state that's home rule, right? And so the localities have the ability to say no, right? And so then, like, so there are all these things that are like playing a role, right? So there are these policies, systemic, right, that created segregation, right? And so that segregation was kind of built in the first half of the 20th century through a combination of like federal policy and local practice, right? We're going to insert these racial restrictions in home deeds to make neighborhoods all white, right? And at the federal level, we're going to grade neighborhoods for risk based on who lives there, right? And we're going to say that you can't qualify for federal mortgage insurance if your neighborhood is integrated, essentially, if your neighborhood isn't, homogenous, right? And so there are these federal things happening that are then being enforced locally, and there are these local practices, right? And then there's zoning, local law also, right, that reinforces these patterns of segregation that we're already building and that protect, right? Zoning was used in many ways to protect white enclaves, right? Exclusionary zoning, expulsive zoning, right? We're going to make sure this whole neighborhood is single family, and we've already essentially disenfranchised people we consider non-white from the biggest wealth building structure in American history, right? Home ownership, right? We've disenfranchised this population from doing that. It's become very difficult. Very few African Americans and people considered non-white were able to own homes, right? So we've already effectively done that, which has created these wealth inequalities, right, that we still see today, right? And we there was a pretty good system in place. I don't want to say good, but I want to say well constructed is what I mean by good, right? System in place to exclude people considered non-white, right? And specifically African Americans, right, from the best jobs, from promotions and things. Like a lot of unions discriminated and things like that, right? So there was this, so then the ability to earn incomes comparable was challenged significantly, right? So there was some disenfranchisement on the employment side as well, creating this combination of wealth and income inequality, right, that we still see today, right? And so the exclusionary zoning, really at this point targets income, but there's that overlap, right? There's that
and that exclusionary zone that you're talking about with the income also, I feel like leads to that socioeconomic segregation, where you have
it continues
all this
that
poverty in one neighborhood, but these great pockets of wealth over 2 miles down the street.
Well, and being your own municipality, right? Having the power to zone is how municipalities are able to do that. Why you have Bexley in, the middle of the southeast side surrounded, essentially, right? That's how that happens, right? Is the power and Bexley, how Bexley was created. It was 3 planned suburban developments that realized that if they came together and incorporated, became a village, right? And then a city, because of population side, they could zone and keep people out. It's about exclusion, right? And then, if there are people of color living in the neighborhood, there are all these attempts throughout history, right, to expel, right, to direct, so like Flint Ridge Terrace, that neighborhood? So that's a neighborhood off of Flint Road on the far north side. So it's Columbus, but it's Worthington schools. And it's
right. Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
And so an African-American couple bought that property, and it was developed basically as a Black suburban neighborhood. So Blacks could actually have their own homes because they were really being excluded from buying an established suburbs. So they, and this happened all over the country. African-Americans would build their own suburbs, because it was so difficult to, and it was risky. There was, personal, physical risk, mental, psychological risk associated with with integrating neighborhoods. There was harassment that occurred and things like this, right? And so Flint Ridge Terrace, there's a book about its history, and in that book they talk about the multiple attempts like to zone the area industrial. That's
I have to
expulsive.
include that link in the description box or something for that book. But yeah, that sounds fascinating.
But so there's this big history of that, right? And so this is kind of the segregation enforced at all of those levels, right? And then there's how we value houses would be the second thing I would say in terms of like long-term system, because of the segregation, because of the history of exclusion. The way the formulas used to determine housing valuations are very dependent upon the surrounding neighborhood. Well, how were those neighborhoods created?
Exactly.
Right? Some neighborhoods were favored and invested in, right? Redlining is a disinvestment policy. Well, there are neighborhoods that were graded blue and green on that map too. That's an investment. That's saying investment is welcome here. And that's where new housing was built. That's where property values appreciated, right? And so these policies have two sides, right? And so housing
Makes
valuations with their, and look at neighborhoods like North Linden, right? And then North Clintonville, right?
Right,
very
exactly.
Similar housing stock.
Right. I remember you saying that the housing stock is very similar. I can't even talk. You got the railroad track though that divides them, but the values of the homes, if you're in Linden versus if you're in Clintonville, are drastically different.
Yeah, I mean, and what are the differences? Today, the differences are, well, there have been differences in investments in those homes, right? And there's differences in school districts. Which one comes first, though? Is it the school district that's really encouraging that investment? Because it's the same district, but don't mean district. I mean, there's differences in the schools themselves, right? The quality of the schools in that Clintonville feeder pattern compared to pretty much every other feeder pattern in Columbus, there's some big differences. There's almost like it's a favored feeder. It'd be interesting to see investment in that feeder pattern versus others over time, because I would be willing to bet that, or even with Worthington, just north of that, different school district, even wealthier, even more expensive homes, right?
Right,
but very similar housing stocks, right?
It's true, because I have a friend right now. She lives in a rental that's in Columbus, when you look at the geographical boundaries, but the kids would go to Worthington schools, and she's like, there's no way in the world I would be able to afford a house like right here, or definitely don't cross the street and go to Worthington, like looking at just even those challenges.
Yeah, and so that, and so that's one of two. And then the third thing I would say that's systemic is kind of what I would say. There's a book that talks about this. You've heard of NIMBYism?
Yes. Oh my goodness.
Like
not
in my backyard. Yeah. And so there's this new way of thinking about it. These scholars coined called neighborhood defenders. There's a book called Neighborhood Defenders. And so they're saying, people call these people NIMBY, but really, if you look at what they actually say and do, they present themselves as defenders of neighborhoods. And they credentialize, I don't even know if that's a word, themselves, though, as they walk up to the podium to speak against development. Well, I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life. I've owned the house on Plum Street since 1974, whatever. I've been here. It's, I am the defender of this. I know what belongs in this neighborhood, right? But they're, in the study in this book, these people, it was quantified, and they're not really representative of the neighborhood. They're older, they're whiter, they're more male, they're wealthier, they're more conservative, right, than the average person in the community, right? But they have an outsized voice, and they show up. Right? Showing up is what politicians listen to, right? And
it's
so
true. And when you're working 2 or 3 jobs to be able to afford where you live, you're not going to show up at these city council meetings or commission meetings.
Retired rich people who know the system.
Retired rich people who are homeowners. Right, exactly.
Yeah, comfortable speaking up in those, very formal, very white spaces, using the Roberts rules and all the stuff you use in the public meetings. But these people have this power because we're a home rule state in part. They have this because these decisions are made locally. Because Morpsey doesn't have the authority to say, y'all need to build your fair share of affordable units. Every municipality, Dublin's going to say no. Dublin has the right to say no. And Dublin isn't going to build affordable housing.
And they are saying no. I know there's been some news articles recently where they basically said Dublin doesn't really want to build
Yeah,
affordable housing.
no,
And
no
somebody
interest
else
in it.
was telling me that there are some people, I can't remember which group of people in Dublin, that are basically saying, we don't have poor people here. And it's like, well, that's because they live outside the city because they can't afford to
But
live
they
there.
attend your schools. And people in
Exactly.
Dublin are happy their
They
kids are in
work
such
in
diverse
Dublin.
schools. They just don't want to live with, like, it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it?
It is. But I'm trying to
Mhm.
remember, did you finish sharing what that third one is? Because
That
I'm
it's the
really interested.
neighborhood defenders, really getting into, and it's about that fragmented metro, right? We have a lot of jurisdictions. They're all competing against each other, right? And tax base is what rules. You know, they need a strong tax base and they need residents that don't cost a lot. So there's very little incentive for building affordability, and no one can make them. And then you've got these people who have an outsized voice when they're not really representative of the general population, right? But they're almost controlling the process because, and they participate. These are the same people that end up on planning commissions and area commissions and things like that, right? This is problematic, right? And so, you know, what, you know, if I don't know if you're going to ask, you're going to go, what's the
Well, I
solution
want to
next?
ask you, yeah, what can we even do? What can we
Vote,
as regular
vote and
people do
show
to
up.
change these solutions?
Vote
You
and
said
show
show up,
up.
but what about the person who's working a couple of different jobs? What would you suggest? Their
Write
schedule is tight,
letters.
money's
You
tight.
can write to city council, and city council reads those letters and organize, right? This is where we're getting our butt kicked, right? These neighborhood
Right.
defenders are organized. They
They
got
are
people
so
showing up
organized.
at every meeting and they're organized,
Right.
right?
They're
We can
meeting to get
organize
their
too.
talking points
Yeah.
together, figuring
We
out
can
who's
make it
going to be
easy.
speaking. That's
Like we can, like, especially in these suburban neighborhoods where you've got people who are interested. And let me tell you something, the interest in affordability in these neighborhoods is genuine because you've got a lot of older adults who are saying, I want to be able to age here. And like, there's nothing for me to move into and there's nothing I can afford. Right. So they want affordability for themselves as they're aging. Two, they want their kids to be able to buy close to them. They want to live by their grandkids, quite frankly. Right. And they want their grandkids in the neighborhood they know is nice and good and all that good stuff, but their kids can't afford to buy it
Can't
because they're like
afford it, right?
me right now. Right.
Because I
So
know
you've
so
got
many people who,
Mhm.
you know, have adult children living with them because they cannot afford to buy their
Yep.
own homes right now. So
Yeah.
they're like living in the basement level. In some cases, them and their spouses and their kids are living in the
Yep.
basement level of their parents' home because they can't afford to buy right now.
And it's just, it's crazy. And that's the reality for young people and for households that are, you know, and it's not only single earning households. You can be a two earning household and still be making, you know, around the
Exactly.
median area income. You got those student loan debts, you got childcare you're paying for. You cannot
Yes.
afford a $400,000 starter home. That isn't a starter home price.
Right.
And
That's
that's
about
where a lot of places are going, especially if you want to be in a good school district, or, you know, what we call good school district or good feeder pattern, as you might call it in Columbus City schools, right? But if you want to be in those areas, it's becoming just really, and if you want enough bedrooms for your family, right? It's becoming really difficult. So the things you can do, though, go to city council, engage with city council, get on area commissions if you have the ability, write letters. That's something you can do if you're working all the time. Vote for candidates that are serious about this stuff. And the more you speak up and organize, the more you speak up and the more you organize, the easier it will be for candidates to support these things and for these things to
right.
happen.
That makes
And the
sense.
other thing I would say is that, you know, for people who maybe are working in local government, right? Making these changes requires changes to your zoning code. And any development in your community is always contentious. I know that. I'm a student of cities. I know what it's like when anything changes in a city, even though the nature of cities is to change. But
right.
one of the ways you can help, like I just described, in all of these suburbs, there is concern among a cohort of the population about being able to age in the suburb and having their kids being able to live there. And really, in most of the single family neighborhoods in the region, I would argue, there's that concern, right? Because these neighborhoods are overwhelmingly single family. Where are you going to, how are you going to downsize when every house is the same size and got like 2 floors and a basement you got to go down and do laundry in, right?
Exactly.
So So these changes, and with the growth our region is going to be experiencing, we're going to have to densify. We're going to have to change things. Columbus is already looking at its zoning code. Some of the suburbs are considering it. What I would remind policymakers of, because a lot of policymakers, elected officials in particular, don't necessarily have backgrounds in planning and use.
Makes sense.
But zoning is about values. Zoning is a statement of a city's values. It tells you who is welcome. Broadly, right? Like who we want to live here, what businesses we want to thrive here, and who we want to invite to spend money here. And also, equally as importantly, in the state of Ohio, at least, because of our overwhelming dependence on income tax at the municipal level for it's a blueprint for your city budget, because it tells you what types of income your tax, what kind of revenue you're going to get, right? And so that, and then what does the city budget translate into? It translates into services for residents. That package of services is a reflection of that community's values.
Listen, right? I was about to go on a tangent here, but yeah, I'm with you. When you look at that, especially because, that zoning piece, I feel like is critical, and especially in a city like Columbus, because we're not building as densely as we could. I mean, we could house a lot more people, a lot more affordably.
What does it say about what we value, right? If we have we have a relatively exclusionary, I would say actually very exclusionary zoning code. We have a very single family heavy zoning code in Columbus, right? And that's
I guess this hasn't been updated since about 1950.
Yeah, it's like 70 years old, which also it's a reflection of the values of the 1950s, which were values of segregation, right? And exclusion and privileging the few, right?
Exactly, because it reminds me a lot of the book Getting Around Brown.
Oh, great
book. Think of how people were able to get around that Brown versus the Board of Education, because I know that a lady I know just mentioned recently that the first part of Brown, the first phase, as she would call it, was about the educational system, but the second part was more about the communities and the housing and looking at that whole section. And we're still in that piece.
Oh, we can't seem to get past it in this country. But so if you work for, if you work at the municipal level, zoning codes are important. And like the way Columbus is doing, they're like, I'm going to go after this to give public testimony to Columbus, and I'm going to talk about zoning the same way I just did with you, because one of my concerns about the way that the Columbus is approaching this, they're focusing on corridors and issues to begin with. Corridors and issues are not accessible for people, but do you know what is? What I want my community to look like broadly and what matters to me. And that's a conversation about values. That's the visioning required to establish what the community's values are. You build that zoning process out of the values. And the reason you want to do that, the reason that's so important, is because every development issue is going to be contentious. Those neighborhood defenders are real. There are a lot of them. They got nothing better to do, and they're coming to those meetings. They're going to say, we don't want this here. This doesn't fit with the character of the community. I don't want those people. I don't want this to harm my property values. Whatever they're going to say. The same old things, which, by the way, none of those things have been proven to be true empirically. Like density does not harm property values. It tends to increase property values, in fact. But they're going to keep doing that. Right. And so where was I going with that? Darn it. But that's why you need to be able to remind people, right?
About our values and
the values, right? This, this development here is how your son can afford to live here. And that was important to you. Do you remember? Or these, this zoning, this new zoning category will build the kind of housing that you can downsize into in an affordable way. And that is what you said was important. You got to be able to bring it back to the values that we already identified. And by starting with issues, I think that Columbus is going to run into more contention, because you're going to have contention no matter what down the line.
That is true. You're going to have the contention.
Yeah.
But listen, I guess we better wrap things up. I could have this conversation for a whole nother hour because it's so juicy. But thanks again, Glennon, and we'll see how the rest of these episodes go. But I'm really excited for this first conversation and looking at what's possible.
Yeah, I cannot wait to listen with you. All right.